Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. It's just Richie here today. JM is in lockdown in South Korea, but don't worry, all is well, which is the main thing, and I hope you're well too and virus free wherever you may be. I've seen some crazy and saddening things in this past week. Things that belong in the world of fiction. People rushing to supermarkets to stockpile pasta, toilet paper, beans and all manner of junk food. Aggressive mothers with trolleys stacked high, elbowing and kicking anyone who appears to glance in their direction. The shelves wiped clear, leaving a few foul-flavoured pot noodles for the old lady, already horrified and afraid of what she's hearing and reading every day. The leader of her country telling the nation that loved ones will die, that the vulnerable, indeed her very self, will bear the brunt of what's to come. No reassurance offered, no compassion, no help nor love, not from her leader, nor from anybody else in our self-centered society, it seems. Within a matter of days it feels as if the entire world has gone into a frenzied shutdown. Collectively, humanity has retreated into a shell. Gossip and fake news are rifer than the virus itself. When panic and fear become the norm, the innate instinct to survive kicks in. Survival of the fittest, dog eat dog. The whole stockpiling fiasco is evidence enough of that. COVID-19, or whatever it's called today, poses a threat to us all, but the greater threat to humanity is still itself. The gun still hovers over the temple, finger stroking the trigger. Humanity will destroy itself before any virus does, and what we're seeing now is the very worst in people. All we can do is hope. Indeed, hope is all we have left, that we learn as a species from this coronavirus craziness. But if history has taught us anything, humanity is somewhat lacking when it comes to learning from the past. But there have been a lot of inadvertent benefits from this global lockdown. The environment, for example, is benefiting from the pause in industry and travel. Just look at Venice. There was a dolphin appeared in its waters for the first time in 60 years. There's all kinds of schools of fish swimming around, and people can actually see the bottom of the canals. And another benefit is that a lot of people now have a lot more time on their hands. I've heard people who have never heard talk about books saying they're stockpiling them like toilet rolls for their weeks of isolation. So, what else can you do with all this time, all these lonely hours? Well, one big one is write, of course. So in this episode, I wanted to talk about a few things you could do to make the most of all this free time. And number one is help others. In this bizarre and crazy period of our lives, it's easy to allow helplessness to consume you. Everybody has the ability to help someone in some way or another. And as writers, what do we have to help? What do we have to give to the world? Books and stories, entertainment. So this week, I made a decision to give away ebook versions of my two books, Flying on the Ground and A Fantasy Writer's Handbook, to those people stuck in isolation. Like I said before, I've heard people say they're stockpiling up on books for the long hours indoors. Well, if you're looking for something to read, have these copies. If they can help you take your mind off this madness, even for just a little while, then it's worth it. So if you're a writer and you've got some books out, why not try something similar? I ran mine as a special offer through Amazon. I had to enlist my books in Kindle Unlimited for 3 months to get access to the offer, but I have to say it's been worth it. I've had so many positive comments from people saying how they're helping them cure their boredom. That alone makes it worthwhile. And an added bonus is that I've been able to shift over 200 copies and I've shot up the bestseller lists. So thank you everyone who's downloaded so far. So from your perspective, what you could look to do if you didn't want to do that through Amazon, you could email copies out of your books to your mailing list. You could serialize stories or chapters of your novel on your blog or social media pages for your followers. You could do what I'm doing now, which is a podcast or an audio recording, or you could even do something like make videos. I mean, what we have now, the benefit we have is that we have so much more time to experiment with and find new ways of reaching our audience, and an audience that is actively engaged because they've got all this free time. Just dedicate a bit of time to playing around with marketing techniques, and you never know, you might benefit from it. So Moving on to our second point, and this is something that came from one of our regular listeners, Keith. Hello, Keith. Shout out to Keith there if you're listening today. I hope you're well and virus free. So Keith's query was all about developing ideas and finishing projects. So Keith wrote to me to say that he has an idea and a scene, but he doesn't know where to take it. So that's a very good query, I think, Keith. I think that happens to a lot of people, and it's one I struggle with for a long time. I get an idea for a scene, we'll get super excited about using it in the story, but quickly lost momentum when I couldn't find a way of building a story around it. So I think the problem that I ran into with this approach is that I was looking at the story or trying to create it from the wrong angle. I used to regard plot as the king, but although it's important, I've learned that a couple of other things need to be considered first, and then that helps you come up with the plot. So bear in mind, this is just my approach. It works for me, it may not work for you. So number one for me is the premise. This is the purpose of the story. What is it about? In other words, the theme. What point are you trying to make? Personally, I take a more of a laid-back approach to premise. I know a lot of writers would argue differently. Sometimes I have a vague idea of what the story is about. Sometimes I haven't quite set on a theme, or if I've got a few different themes that I'm exploring. So I don't always completely settle on a premise. Though, as the Hungarian playwright Lajos Egri, he would argue differently. He regarded the premise as the foundation of any story, and to quote Egri, how do you know which way to go if you don't know your destination? And I have to say that is quite a good point. So always think about premise first. This is my approach, so I always think about premise first, and then the second consideration is character. So who are they? What makes them interesting? Why should we care about them? What do they want in their lives? What are their goals, their aims, their objectives? And importantly, what is preventing them from achieving them? In other words, what are the conflicts in their lives, the obstacles to their success? And this now begins to tie in with your point, Keith, of plot. So character and plot are intrinsically linked. In order to create a compelling plot, we must first know our characters, know their wants and their desires, and what obstacles stand in their path. The plot is born from the conflict. It is born from them trying to overcome their obstacles to achieve their desires. So Keith, in short, I'd say have a think about how that idea fits in with a premise. Then consider the possible characters you could feature to explore that premise and populate your scene. This way you can build up the jigsaw puzzle of your story and hopefully find the place where your scene slots in. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't get to use those ideas right away, but as with anything, write them down and they'll always be there in the back of our minds, stewing, waiting for their moments to shine. So I'm going to move on to our third point, which is reading. Now this sounds like a bit of a daft one because we read all the time, but now we have a lot more time to do it. I mean, I always intend to read much more than what I do, but like I say, time just gets away from me. I'm always one for a good fiction book, a stack of them in front of me here. But when I find myself with a few extra hours, I absolutely love to delve into books on the craft of writing. I learn something new every time I open one, and a sense of continuous self-improvement is a good arsenal to have in your writer's toolbox. If you do have that, you won't get complacent and it'll keep you grounded. A question that always pops into my mind when I'm reading over my work is, how can I say this better? And if I have this question constantly stewing in my brain, then I always feel like I can improve, and that keeps me on a good path. And I think it can help a lot of people too if you stick with that mindset. So I have a few books on writing that I always keep close to hand. My favourite one is by a writer I've already mentioned, Lajos Egri, and his book is called The Art of Dramatic Fiction. This book in particular changed my understanding of writing in so many ways. I couldn't recommend it more highly. You're just going to have to read it. Stein on Writing by Solstein is another excellently helpful read, with a cracking little section on writing non-fiction too, for anyone interested in journalism or blogging. The Art of Fiction by John Gardner is another excellent book, and Gardner's writing style is quite hypnotic too. Lots can be learned from him, so he's definitely worth checking out. I'm also a big fan of the first 5 pages by Noah Lukeman, which provides a detailed and cutting view on writing from the editor's perspective. For those unfamiliar with Noah Lukeman, he's one of the industry's leading editors, so his insights are fantastic. Letters to a Young Writer by Irish writer Colin McCann is another good book if you're looking for inspiration. The obvious one is On Writing by Stephen King, which is probably the most famous book on writing, and it is a good book too. You're going to learn a lot if you read that, so it's well worth a read. And of course you've got A Fantasy Writer's Handbook, which someone described as the seminal work on the subject. So, make it that what you will, Stephen King. I'll put all them links and titles in the description at the end. You can have a peruse if you can get access to them, if Amazon are still delivering in this coronavirus world. And the last point I want to talk about is planning. So, as a serial procrastinator myself, I know the joys of being faced with free time, but invariably I take my foot off the gas and find myself spinning round in my chair 2 hours later, having done nothing but check Facebook and emails a few times. Now, not everyone is the same, but I find it helpful to set myself targets or goals. I will get to page 10 by the end of the day, or I will finish that story by Sunday. It keeps your mind focused, and naturally you end up wasting less hours. So, to help me do this, I like to keep a lot of to-do lists. I find the visual reminder really helpful. And there's one thing I use a lot of paper and pens is the main one I'd use for to-do lists, but to keep that sort of visual reminder if you're doing a lot of computer-based work, you can get an app for Windows called Sticky Notes, which I find very helpful, and it just is like a little pop-up in the top corner of your screen, and that just gives you a list, or you can basically type whatever you want in it. It doesn't really have to be made for lists, but give it a whirl and see what you think. So that's basically it today. It was just a quick episode just to talk about a few ways you can make the most of all these hours of isolation. So helping others is so important in this moment in time. It just feels like humanity is sort of disintegrating. So if we can help in any way that we can, it's so worth it. As writers, we are the sources of entertainment. So hopefully we can make people's lives a little bit better with our words and our craft. Secondly, finish those projects. Hopefully that helps you there, Keith, with them ideas. Reading. Make the most of your reading time. This is a good opportunity to learn as well as to enjoy reading fiction. We've got lots of time to kill. And lastly, planning. Make the most of all this free time. Don't waste it like I do. With all this free time, I think JM and I will be doing a few more episodes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with Charles Remington, who's a writer, a book reviewer for Reader's Favourite, and also he's the editor of a new book of 2-sentence horror stories called Nano Nightmares. Now, I was lucky enough to get a few stories of mine published in this book. It's out officially on the 2nd of April, though I do think you can get it early on Amazon. So I'm going to read you out one of my stories now. It doesn't actually have a title, so enjoy, and until next time, chaps, please stay safe and keep washing those hands. I'd caught him staring at me from across the room with those oddly coloured eyes, one dark, the other blue, and now he was following the clop of my heels along the dark and quiet street. Almost running, I chanced to look over my shoulder and couldn't see him over the tops of the cars. But before I could exhale a sigh of relief, a wolf-like howl shattered the night and set every hair on my body on edge.